Welcome to this episode of The Self-Led Leader. Today, I am so excited to share the conversation that I was able to have with Simone Schiassi, the former global director at Google. We got to unpack modern leadership, how you can develop your executive presence, and really how going back to certain specific basics will make the difference between you being a good leader and a great one that gets the recognition and the impact that you're looking for. So, without further ado, let's jump right into things. And I can't wait for you to get all of the amazing insights that we shared. Welcome to The Self-Led Leader, a podcast for high performers who want to lead from alignment, not expectation. I'm Dr. Christina Ady, a social psychologist, and I'm here to help you lead with clarity, not chaos. This show is about what happens before the strategy, your mindset, your nervous system, the inner leadership that shapes everything you say and do. Because presence isn't about being loud, it's about being aligned. Let's get right into it. Okay, welcome to the Self-Led Leader podcast. I'm so excited to have you on the show and get into the nitty-gritty of everything around executive presence, authenticity, and leadership. But before we do that, could you just tell us a little bit about you, about your journey, and what it was like for you to be in such an important role at Google?
Yeah. Hi, Christina. Thank you so much for having me in the podcast. Yeah, I've been at Google for 15 years. I started in 2010 and I joined as a sales rep in Dublin. As an old fashioned, I sent my CV. I applied for a role for a salesperson that was speaking Italian, and they took me. So I packed my bag and I moved to Dublin. I didn't know what I was getting into, and I started, making phone calls, trying to sell Google email for businesses. And from there, my journey started, and I got into sales management. I managed the EMEA team, and then after a few years, I moved to the US to the headquarters in Mountain View of Google. And I took a role to open global call centers for Google Cloud. And I came back to Dublin. I had another couple of roles, always as a global director of Google's extended workforce first, managing the strategy and operation for the 200,000 temps, vendors, and contractors of Google. And then I managed strategy operation for the Google Food, which is the team that feeds the hungry Googlers, serving 320,000 meals a day. And then after a while, I decided to come back to my home country, which is Italy, and open a new chapter and leave the corporate world, but help, build the next generation of leaders with everything I've learned at Google.
Amazing. It's so funny almost to think back to the days where you would sell Gmail, because Gmail is like such a staple now. Like, who would not have Gmail?
Yeah, exactly. And many people didn't know what was for business, which kind of didn't exist yet. We were building as we were selling it. So it's been a fun ride.
For sure, definitely. Well, I'd love to unpack a little bit more about what leadership was like, especially at Google. I feel like Google is such a
Mhm.
revered company that everyone looks up to as like the standard. So, from your experience, I'd love to hear like how would you describe the concept of executive presence?
Mhm. Yeah, executive presence it boils down to how people will remember you, the image of you in their minds, how you're perceived, how you're heard, how you thought about, and how you felt, right? So we attach the term executive, but it's not just for executives or it's just an attribute. But basically, it's, if I meet you a few times, I'll remember Christina in a certain way, smiling, very, very nice. And if I read your post, I know you're very knowledgeable and I feel very comfortable speaking with you, for example. That's your executive presence in my mind. And while it's so hard to give feedback or describe executive presence to someone, is because there are so many dimensions that ultimately, when you meet me down the alley, you feel like smiling or you feel avoiding me, right? That's also, unconscious mechanisms that kick in once all the dimensions of executive presence come together. So basically, it's my image in your mind.
Yes, I agree with that. I think many people often overlook how they actually are to other people, exactly as you said. We have these preconceived definitions of what we think about ourselves, but it almost doesn't matter because if everyone else
Mhm.
sees you and just turns the other way and avoids you, like it doesn't matter what you think of yourself at that point, which is a little bit harsh to say, but true. So I'd love to unpack all the different nuances of executive presence a little bit more. So maybe
Mhm.
I'll start with introducing you to the way that I've broken it down previously.
Yeah.
And I've defined it into four pillars, which I call the PCRA. So it's the presence, exactly as you said, like the energy in which people are showing up, communication skills, their relationships and their ability to actually create and maintain relationships at different levels, and then their appearance, which appearance
Mhm.
always seems a little bit superficial on the surface. And yet, I'd argue that it matters the way that you
It
look
does matter.
physically.
Yeah.
Yes. So,
And it's
um,
really hard to give feedback, sorry to interrupt, but
yeah,
like
yeah.
to someone about their appearance, right?
Yes.
It happened with a client of mine the other day, and it wasn't a direct feedback, but it's like you should be thinking about how you want to show up, whether you wear a t-shirt or a collared shirt, sort of that's the image people have of you over video conference, for example, right? If you have like an iron t-shirt, either you're the CEO of some company or some crazy genius inventor, and you can sport an iron t-shirt, or else.
Yeah, it's interesting because I noticed a shift during COVID, during the pandemic. I think we all got very, very cozy at home. And there was this massive shift on Zoom where all of a sudden it was just taken less seriously. So prior to what I'm doing now, I worked for a little bit for a different consulting company where I would train different doctors, students, medical professionals who were interviewing for different jobs. And part of that was interviewing through Zoom. And it was so
Mhm.
interesting to notice how many people did not pay attention to the details, like how they looked, whether the lights were on, if the doors were closed, if their camera was actually pointing at them or somewhere else. And like all of these little things are so nuanced, but they contribute so much to every aspect of appearance and executive presence. And so, I guess, what are some of the faux pas that you have seen commonly pop up with something like appearance?
Yeah. Well, as you just mentioned, I cannot even start counting the, shaky video conference with laptop on your knees, and with the kitchen, and like, you don't need to have a recording studio. I get it, but at least a quiet, well lit environment, so that you don't, seem like you're taking the call from your garage. So like basic rules, really. And I think, as you say, for some reason, people just didn't look at this stuff as if they were coming in the office physically in their pajamas. Like, would you do that? Right? You wouldn't. So why would you show up in a way that portrays you in a kind of sloppy way?
Yeah.
So you could see very difference between who could curate their background a little bit, just a little bit care for others. And as far as appearance, there's no formal dress code at Google yet. I think, just sort of business casual, without, necessarily dressing up, or just being normal. Like I feel sometimes people like lose the definition of what's normal and what's like socially acceptable, and without judgment. I don't care. I've seen engineers going barefoot, at Google. I don't judge. However, I guess that they wouldn't, be maybe in executive meetings with the CEO. That's all I'm saying.
Yeah, yeah, very true. We'll leave that there. Okay, let's unpack communication a little bit more. I really, really like the topic of communication. I think it's something that's so often overlooked, especially because so many people have this misconception that they speak every day. Therefore, they are good
Mhm.
at speaking. They talk at work every day. Therefore, their level of communication is good enough. And I would disagree with that. And I think good communication is so much more nuanced. And so I'd love to hear from you first, from your perspective, and just thinking back to like the different types of leaders you've seen and you've worked with. What are the
Mhm.
differences between someone who's just like good and someone who's great at communicating and at leadership?
Yeah. Yeah. I witnessed many leaders, and I think the excellent ones refrain from speaking too much,
Mm,
and, associating the speaking with like deep listening and active listening, which is an important component. So they don't speak for the sake of speaking. They let others speak. They take in the information. They're curious. And then they express their point of view in a concise way. Very clear, very simple, and concise way. Those to me are the most effective leaders. The opposite is someone that, just rambles and takes all the air in the room, doesn't let others speak, maybe in an attempt to assert some dominance somehow in the communication, which is wrongly attributed to executive presence, which I think it's a whole another chapter to explore. The more you speak, the more you kind of shout about your opinion, the more leader you're seen, which I think it's quite the opposite. So I think effective communication is a really deep listening phase, and then kind of clarity, simplicity at the end, sort of bringing everyone together, everyone's opinion together.
Yeah, I'd agree with that. I like that too, because I'm going to add from a psychological point of view, it's actually best if leaders speak last, because otherwise they're just swaying the room unintentionally. And it's something that I think so many of us first to think, like, I would never do that. I'm not going to get swayed. I'm opinionated. I can speak my mind. And yet, there's so much research out there to show that how we think we act does not equate how we actually act in these
Mm.
situations. And so, to your point, a great leader really does speak last after considering everyone's point of view and then sort of combobulating and putting the pieces together in a way that's clear and makes sense and is true to them and their opinion. So, I like that. Okay, let's break down next. Let's do relationships next. I think relationships is an
Mhm.
interesting one, especially if we are to consider the way that I like to think about it, one-on-one relationships that leaders must have, as well as maintaining relationships within the team without them. So, what's your take sort of on the ability to maintain these relationships? What should go into it? And maybe what are some of the faux pas as well?
Mhm. Yeah, I think good relationships are sort of twofold, right? One is how you as a leader set the standards to create these relationships. And I think what I've seen a lot, unfortunately, is leaders not addressing some behaviors between team members, maybe in public setting, and not addressing that is an implicit message that that behavior is okay, right? The standards you walk by are the standards you're willing to accept. And I think that shapes a lot the relationship between people because they're modeled by the leader, right? And as a leader, you're under the microscope. Everyone looks at what you do, what you say, which, it seems logical, but it's actually very, in everyday life, people really are looking up to their leaders and everything they do. And on the relationship with others, the other peers, or more senior folks, is sort of the art of influencing, right? And I approach it from the point of view of curiosity and try to understand what everyone else is trying to achieve, what are the pain points, and how I can serve them, and then ultimately kind of reach a common goal.
Hmm. I'd love to hear more about your experience tailoring your leadership to different team members, because I'm a big proponent of everyone having different learning styles, different cultural backgrounds, different personalities. And I think when it comes to leadership, it's not like a one size fits all. And I think there's a fine line between treating everyone equally, but also tailoring it to match it in a way that sort of fits their style, their motivations, their personality. So I'd love to hear
Mhm.
more about your thoughts on that.
Yeah, it varies a lot, right? And that goes into the topic of delegation, if you will, which is not handing tasks, but rather it's the art of understanding how people want to work with you and be communicated with, right? And my theory here is there's not one style for one person, but there's one style for each task that that person performs. Let me explain. If I'm a programmer, right, you wouldn't come to me and explain how to program a basic thing, right? But maybe you would come to me and explain more details about a financial model if I need to develop one. So Whether you're very autonomous in a task or you need some more guidance, it doesn't depend on you as a person. It depends on the task you have at hand. So the delegation piece and the way you work with team members depends on what on the stage of the task they're dealing with. And sometimes when someone comes to you and asks, "Hey, where's the fridge?" You don't ask back, "Where do you think it is?" You say, "It's in the kitchen," because they clearly need that level of guidance, right? So it's really a journey of discovering their skills and their preference. Sometimes someone's like, "Look, just tell me the answer and you're going to relieve me from this pain," right? They're not going to tell you this way, but that's what
Yeah.
you feel. And sometimes it's like, no, just throw it at me and I'll deal with it, right? It takes time, it takes building relationship and also an open communication. I think rarely leaders ask, how would you like me to work with you on this? Would you prefer me to tell you the steps, or would you prefer me to just give you the thing and you come back in a week? Let's talk about it, right?
Yeah.
I'm not sure why, but these conversations don't happen very often.
I agree with you. And I want to unpack that a little bit more because it's something that I see as well, where there's this trend to just problem solve, to go, go, go. And I get that everyone's busy. And I get that it's almost like the default reaction that everyone is programmed to think leadership is. But to your point, I think there is so much value in slowing down, in asking the questions, into actually building these relationships with your team members so that you can tailor it and adjust it and have even just like the concept of psychological safety and having that open relationship for communication. Like it's not a waste of time is really what I
Yeah,
want to get at. Like it's crazy how that makes me
it's an investment that returns tenfold,
yeah.
right? And I work with several leaders that struggle with delegation. Delegation is a function of building a relationship and understanding a team member. Like, oh, it's just easier if I do it. Yeah, sure. It may be easier if you do it, but you know what's down the line? When do you need to do it again and 10 times more? And like it's almost this short termism where you don't invest in the growth of your people, because investing in growth of your people is not sending them to a course, is not doing the one-to-ones weekly. It's when you're actually pressed for time and when it's urgent, refraining from the urge of taking stuff away from them, right? That's, everyone is good at talking about, yeah, I'm good at delegating, but when you have 5 minutes, you're in a rush, you need to meet your boss and you need to run home. That's where you need to stick to to what you said you would do.
Yeah. It's no, I agree with that. I think it's something that I see as well. And it's always a little bit challenging because, on the one hand, you have to teach the people you work with the skill of delegating. And on the other hand, it's almost like the mindset component, like the resistance of in the moment when they need to delegate and that urge comes up
Mhm.
of like, I'll do it this time. I'll delegate next time. They're busy, they're stressed. Like, I'll just take it on.
Mhm.
And so it is interesting to see. And so I'd like to pose this question to you next. From your experience and your perspective, if you were to break it down into percentages, when it comes to something like promotions, recognition, the types of things that people are really striving for with leadership, what percentage would you allocate to actually doing like good work? And what percentage would you allocate to something like executive presence and the way that they're just showing up to work?
That's a great question. I think nowadays it's probably around 70% how you are able to present yourself in your work and 30% to your work you do. And it's not because you need to just market what you do and do PR because people think, oh, you just need to, advertise what you do. It's not. It's making sure that your hard work is communicated properly so others can actually benefit from it, that a broader organization can take your learnings and apply them to their context, and that your boss can understand what you're doing so he can be more effective in his role. So it's nothing to do about, look at me, how great I am of the three things I've done. It's more, hey, here's all the things I've done, and here's how you can multiply the impact of my things across the entire organization, if not company. And if you're not able to articulate that, there's a lot of value lost. So you can work really, really hard, but the value that you express is very little or very contained to a specific domain, which is basically yourself and maybe some of
Mm.
your closest colleagues.
Yeah. And so I'd love to dig into that a little bit more because I've heard from a few different clients I've worked with this concept of like, but I'm humble. But this is uncomfortable because I'm humble. So I'd love to hear what advice you have for someone in that position where they are doing work that's impactful, but they're too humble to speak about it.
Well, look, let's say you're a fantastic employee, right? And you create an entire AI agent system that would, reduce waste of time for hundreds of people, and you don't tell me about it, right? Or you just apply to your little domain and you keep it as a test, and you're not able to articulate how powerful that could be deployed to 10,000 people in the company, right? Well, that's value lost. Like, why would you not advertise your work to have more impact? And it's not being humble, it's actually doing a disservice to your company, and that's how you're judged. So instead of saying, hey, I don't want to be this person, it's a reframe. So like, I need to be that person because everything I've developed is so good that it's worth applying to 10,000 more people.
Hmm. Yeah, I love that. Do you have any practical advice for someone in that position for how they can get out of their own comfort zone and maybe take that next step of just going to their boss, their one higher up with their idea?
Yeah, I think what could be interesting is, getting someone you trust
Mm.
and bouncing ideas off them, um, and try to be as expansive as possible, and have the other person play the role of the cynic and try to tear the idea down so that you can make it stronger,
Mm.
because sometimes it's about confidence
Yeah.
of not being good enough, of not having an idea that's worth discussing. So if you have that peer or mentor or coach, whomever, that can help you shape this idea, strengthen it, and make you feel that's a good idea, and raise your confidence that it's worth discussing, then you can take that first step. Once you take the first step, then the second and third come very easily, because and you realize, like, oh yeah, I'm not actually bragging about what I've done. I'm just bringing this as my gift to the company or my work. And
Mm.
you realize sooner or later that to get promoted and to get to executive roles, that's exactly what you need to do. And not just for yourself, you need to extract and encourage your teams to tell you how
Yeah.
much great work they're doing, so you can kind of connect dots and create solutions that have a broader and broader impact.
Yeah, I really like that advice because I say something similar for the mindset shift that I always recommend. It's like stop looking at it as being conceited or as being, too much out there and look at it as a fact. Like the fact
Hmm.
is, you did this thing. The fact is,
Yeah.
this thing does this. These are the facts and the benefits of the thing. Like just explain the facts. And I find that alone usually helps mitigate so much of that tension that comes up. So that's always a fun one to try as well.
Yeah, and I would
Yeah.
add that you just need to be also quite sharp in
Mm.
delivering what you have done. It's more about, I think, where many people fail is they're going to tell you what they have done, but
Yes.
not the so what.
Yeah.
And really, I couldn't care less about how you got there. I care about, so why is this important? So what? What are you going to do with this? What are we going to do with this? So if you can articulate what you have done in terms of impact
Mhm.
and outcomes, that's going to help much more drive a conversation.
Yeah. And so for anyone new to advocating for themselves, how do you recommend they go about figuring out what the impact of their work is? Like what should they focus on?
Mhm. I always recommend to go down to basics.
Right.
You have your goals, right? Whether you created them yourself or your teams created them for you, or you co-created them, and I will go back to them and try to assign your outcomes to one of the goals.
Yeah.
For example, the fact that you have $1 million of revenue to close, how does the development of that famous AI agent contribute to that,
Yeah.
right? And try to map each outcome to the goal. That's what could be your goal, a company goal, or team goal. And that's how you create this sort of cascade structure of outcomes
Yeah.
that contribute to the ultimate goal of the company.
Yeah, I agree with that. I would just add, I think that, the classic, there's two types of people, those who see the trees and those who see the forest.
Hmm.
And so whichever one you are, it's totally fine. Start there. And so you can either start with the goals and objectives that you have, that your team has, that your, department, your company, whatever, and work up, or start up and then work down. And I think both are
Yeah.
equally valid depending on your personality and your preference. But it's a fun experiment because when I do this with my clients, one is always easier and one is always so much harder, and they just get like lost in the weeds.
Hmm.
And it's just so interesting to me because we are all so incredibly different. And we all, like I said, have the different learning styles, the different preferences, the different lenses through which we see things. And like, why not just tailor the way that you are doing things to that and like make it better? And
Yeah,
so,
absolutely.
yeah. And so, on that note, I'd love to hear more from your experience and your expertise. How do people merge the concept of being authentic and bringing themselves into something like executive presence? And like,
Hmm.
where do they draw the line and how do they draw the line?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think executive presence and authenticity go hand in hand. But let's unpack the definition of authenticity a little bit, because I think people, people, generally the consensus is, oh, being authentic, it means being yourself,
Hmm.
360 degrees and 100% of yourself, which is not true. I think you cannot just say whatever you want because you're an outspoken person, or you're a very direct person, or I know I come across rude, but that's who I am, so here you go, I'm authentic. That's not authenticity. That's actually an emotional sort of response of to an external trigger
Yeah.
eventually. Being authentic is bringing a curated version of your best traits, best qualities to the table, to the discussion. So if I'm a very direct person, I'm going to make sure that I say what I think in a curated way that's appropriate to the context and the people I'm speaking with. And my style should mirror that. But the fact that I say what I think, it doesn't mean that I say everything I think. So it's really that curation and that being deliberate
Mhm.
about building who you are, your values, your beliefs, your style into the room. For example, when I moved to the US, I had to tone down my sarcasm.
Mm.
Coming from Italy and coming from Europe, there's a different level of sarcasm that it's received in a very different way in the US.
Yeah.
Right. So I had to tone that down. Yet, I believe the humor is part of the workplace, it's part of a relationship between people in the workplace. But there needs to be a different kind of humor and a different kind of sarcasm depending on the culture you're in. So that's an example of curating your authenticity. I'm not going to be less humorous, I'm just going to be in a different way.
Yeah. I like that answer a lot. And I completely wholeheartedly agree with it because I also believe the concept of this is just who I am is like an emotional crutch or a cop out
Hmm.
from doing the work and taking
Yeah.
the time to understand how to actually curate and bring out the best versions of you because it is hard and it takes work and it does take that intentional component. And so, someone that's already maybe lacking a little bit of emotional intelligence, someone who's super stressed out, someone who's just resistant to the concept of changing themselves, they may use that excuse of just, this is who I am and I'm being authentic. Like,
Hmm.
why am I being, docking? Why is anyone docking points for this? But
Exactly. Yeah.
yeah,
And then it becomes a personal attack, right? Oh, you don't like who I am. He's like, no, I don't like how you speak in this environment. It had nothing to do with who you are, is what you said and how you said it. And that's why both executive presence and authenticity are two very hard topics to give developmental feedback,
Mm,
right? I don't know if we want to talk a little bit about
yes.
that, but executive presence is one of the classic feedbacks that you get when you don't get your promotion to executive, to director, for example. Or you need to have better executive presence. Okay. What does it mean? It's not being standing tall, or you don't know what to do with that, right? So
Yeah.
that's why your framework and your way to unpacking the pillars of executive presence is so helpful. And I wish more leaders adopted that in a corporate environment, because you need to be very specific. It's like, what exactly of executive presence, should I change or improve? But guess what? Who gives that feedback doesn't know,
Yeah.
because again, it's my image in your head, and
Mhm.
it can be then, the emotional response that you create in me because of factors that I cannot quite pinpoint, right? So if I add that framework, I could say, well, why do I feel uncomfortable around you? Well, let me see. Is that what you say? Is how you say it? Is how, because you show up in a certain way, dress in a certain way, or because you don't smile? If you have those tools, it's so much easier to provide feedback and help your team to work on specific elements of this executive presence.
Yes, and I think you just touched on something that's so incredibly important. And exactly as you said, everyone is interpreting your behavior and just like the concept of you through their own lens. And part of that is partly the way that you show up and the way that you speak. But part of that is completely out of your control, and it is their beliefs, their triggers, their unprocessed trauma, their aspirations that are unmet that they see in you that make them, a little bit
Hmm.
angry.
Yeah.
And exactly to that, it's something that's so like it you need the emotional intelligence and you need the right language to be able to describe it. And so, keeping, I guess, to the side for now, we have no control over how others perceive us to a degree. For someone who wants to work on their executive presence and to build it up and to get some tangible feedback, where do you recommend they start in general?
Yeah, it's a good question. And the last thing you said opens the chapter maybe
Yeah.
for another time, but like of the biases, right?
Ah,
What
yes.
you mentioned
Yeah.
is, you receive a message and then you apply your lens. And so that's a very important chapter. So let's put a pin on it and maybe we'll discuss another time. But I would recommend helping your manager unpack executive presence. I received that feedback. I didn't know what to do with that. I know
Mm,
many managers receive that feedback, don't know what to do with that, and actually do disasters because they think
mm,
they need to be more assertive. So they try to be a little bit more aggressive in meetings, or, you don't know what to do with it, right? So I think I would recommend asking the question, hey, out of, executive presence is pretty broad. Do
mm,
you think it's the way I speak, right? Or do you think it's the way I convey a specific message, or the way I present? Like literally, bringing up those dimensions, and whether they have your precious framework or not, they also can go by some of the dimensions of physical presence, and how they speak and how they behave in a meeting.
yeah,
But also the question is, can you please give me an example
mm,
of where you felt that I didn't have executive presence? You can start from there.
yeah,
And if someone is providing good feedback, which is rare, they will associate that feedback, say, hey, do you remember that meeting the other day? Great. You remember when you said that thing in response to the question? I felt that was, poorly said and it came off as rude. That's how people perceive you now because you've done it a few times, and so on
yeah,
and so forth. But this unfortunately doesn't happen,
mm,
because you get the executive presence feedback every 6 months during the formal review,
yeah.
and examples are long gone. So you're left with not much to work with. So I think stimulating the questions around specific examples is a good start.
Yeah. I'd agree with that. And I will add to it that I think because good feedback is so hard, and even if, I'm a big advocate of asking for feedback from people who know you in the context that you want the feedback in,
Mhm.
because you can ask your family and friends, like, how's my executive presence? But they don't see you at work. So it doesn't
Yeah,
matter.
doesn't matter.
But because it is so hard to get that accurate feedback, one thing that I really advocate for is the self reflection
Mm,
through a few different avenues. So, one of them is actually recording yourself and looking back at the recording. So, that could be Zoom
that's a
calls.
hard one.
That is a hard one, but it's so effective because one of the biggest things that I see people take away is like, shit, like I didn't know that's what I look like. I didn't know that's the
Mhm.
facial expressions I'm making. I thought I
Yeah.
was doing amazing active listening and like sitting straight and like, what is going on? And like, it's such a wake up call. And then the other sort of avenue that I always advocate for is like go and be intentional with looking at examples of other people in your company if you can. If not, then other
Mhm.
people online, YouTube, even like Alex and Layla Hormozy, who are massive and have these like incredible YouTube channels where they teach these skills. It's like you don't have to be constrained to who is in your actual vicinity. You can go find examples of role models who you aspire to be like and just start there. Like, what is it about that person that I consider to be a role model? What is it about them that's like attractive to me in the leadership sense? Like, what are the skills that they have that I really want to have? And then take that self reflection to be like, okay, I lack this. I'm not
Mhm.
doing this. And like, just identifying gaps for yourself is an incredible place to start because it gives you something tangible to work on where it's like, okay, my posture. Nothing else
Mhm.
aside, if I just change my posture, how does my executive presence change? And then everything has ripple effects. So it's kind of
How
my,
would
yeah.
you deal with someone that eventually may not have self-awareness, right? Whether you
Mm,
receive the feedback or not, it might be dismissed,
yeah.
right? It's like, no, it's not true. It's an excuse not to promote me. I'm fine, right? It's all political. I'm exaggerating, right? But if someone dismisses the feedback or doesn't see the feedback, doesn't get the feedback, and so they're not self-aware, what's one recommendation
Yeah.
to raise that self-awareness for everybody, I guess?
Yeah. That's a really great question. And I think I have two answers. I'm a very like tough love approach kind of person. And so part of me just wants to say, like, if they refuse the self awareness, your hands are a little bit tied because you can't force someone to change. You can't force
Mhm.
someone to wake up. They need to have enough negative experiences where they can start to connect the dots and say, like, I've been at 7 different organizations. I've been denied 6 different promotions. 30 people have told me I suck at this thing. Like, eventually, there will come a point where they can connect the dots and say, I am the common denominator and I should be paying attention to this. But
Mhm.
then the sort of more studious answer would be come at it from a different side if you can. So sometimes resistance comes up for people because they don't want to hear these things. It's very confronting psychologically to admit everything that I've been doing sucks and is not as
Mhm.
good as I thought it was. And so if you can take some of that personal bit out of it and like if you disagree with this feedback, right? Like if I'm telling you that your communication skills are not up to par and we need to work on them, and you're just like, no, I'm good. Well, maybe I could come from a different angle and be like, okay, well, what is a great communicator in your eyes? This is your standard. Well, actually, this is my standard. So let me help you bridge this gap and understand why we should. Let
Mhm.
me give you some examples of terrible communicators and the things that happen and the lack of promotions and the lack of recognition. Can we start to connect the dots that way? So I would
Yeah.
say, depending on if you are in the context of corporate giving the feedback, or if you are like in a coaching space, sometimes coming at it from a less personal, direct way just helps mitigate some of that resistance as well.
Yeah, and I think as a corollary here is it's not just the ability to take the feedback,
Yeah.
it's the ability to solicit feedback in a genuine way. And I'll give you an example. Earlier, just now, a friend, we were working on a project together, and she's a brand strategist. Is like, hey, do you mind if I give you some feedback? Because I think you're a little bit lost on part of my LinkedIn profile. And I froze. I was like, oh my gosh, what is she's gonna tell me? Right. And then it turned out there's like, oh my God, this amazing transformation she suggested, and I applied, and it's amazing, right? So I think, being able to receive it and say, okay, well, I did my best. Clearly, I'm not a brand strategist or someone is more experienced than me, so I'm gonna listen. But also the habit is like, hey, how do you think I could improve? Do you have any feedback? And I think everyone says they do it. No one does it.
I love that point, and thank you for sharing that because it is scary. And I think I'm going to break it down into two situations where one, someone offers you the feedback. And exactly as you said, you're there and you're like, well, I can say no and it's going to be awkward. Or I can say yes and it'll be awkward, but I'll at least get something good out of it. But the other sort of situation is like soliciting the feedback, like you said, where it's like
Mhm.
you have to be brave and you have to have the confidence to go up to someone, put them in that awkward position and be like, all right, give me that feedback.
Yeah,
I promise you won't hurt my feelings and I promise the relationship won't change and like lay it on me. And that's really hard and that's really scary. And it's like all I can say, like take a deep breath. Because
yeah.
really what I find is that when someone can go from like, this is really personal and everything about my personality like rides or dies on this feedback,
Mhm.
when you can kind of detach from it and be like, this is just information. Like this is just something I can listen to for a minute. And one thing I like to say is like, whatever you're doing, other people are noticing. And if they have feedback that they're not telling you, they're noticing. So you can keep doing the thing that you're doing terribly for the
Mhm.
next 10 years, or you can get the feedback and actually improve and be better for it, right? So it's like you're going to be
Yeah.
embarrassed either way. Just like pick your poison.
And as a bonus, right, if you're a leader, a manager, asking for feedback is a fantastic way to build psychological safety,
Mm,
because the message you send is like, I'm not perfect. I want to learn. We're in this together. I value you so many ways. Then, you got to accept it. You got to say thank you and not try to justify yourself or find some excuse of why you're doing certain things. Just take it. But that is a great builder of psychological safety.
yeah. So let's unpack that a little bit more. I think psychological safety is another term like authenticity, where it's just like
Hmm.
thrown around the winds of LinkedIn, right?
Yeah.
From your perspective, sort of what goes into creating that psychological safety and like what is it?
Yeah. Well, to me, again, it's stripping some of the layers that we learned as, leaders that are not actually leadership. It's just being kind of normal. Think you're more or better than others, work hand in hand with others, ask for their advice, listen to them, provide genuine feedback with care, which, after so many years, I kind of reconnect by to like, yeah, just be a good person, which is a silly definition, right? But like sometimes you think, as a leader, you need to put an armor on and go with your sword and shield to war, and you need to be the bravest. No, just be like a good person that cares for your team and wants their best. And that's where, psychological safety flourish, and admitting when you're wrong. You read it, we say it all the time, but genuinely say, hey, I messed up, I'll do better, or what could have done better. It's just small things that make the teams feel heard and seen and valued.
Mhm.
Again, I think we are overcomplicating leadership sometimes, and it comes down to human connection because we are not robots yet, but we definitely need that human connection, and that builds psychological safety. It's very simple yet complex.
Yeah, I like that answer. And so, from your perspective, I feel like, especially with maybe someone new to leadership and like the leadership role, a lot of these things that make someone a great leader require removing the ego from the equation. And so,
Hmm.
there's almost like this battle between in the hierarchy of the organization, like I'm above you and I should act a certain way being like above you in the hierarchy, but then also it's like I have to do all these human things and remove my ego and connect and admit that I'm wrong, which is like for some people. And so, how do you recommend going about finding that balance?
Yeah, I mean, I think we tend to mix the org chart
Mm,
with your role,
yeah.
right? Actually, the org chart is flipped, should be an inverse pyramid where the CEO serves everyone above and so on and so forth, right? But, society wants people in power and responsible at the top, and it's all good. But ultimately, you're there to serve. You're a mere custodian, right? Custodian of the growth of people and of the business. When you leave, you just need to leave the place in a better shape than you found it, and people are in a better state than you found them. So you're just a custodian, right? So if you think in that way, it's not about you. It's about making everyone grow and flourish, the business and the people and their careers and their balance and their families and everything. So, and ultimately, you will shine of reflected light.
Mm,
That's the concept, right? It's tricky when you're in a very senior position where you actually don't do things like with your hands on the keyboard, so to speak, right? You're not the one coding, you're not the one building, but you're the one creating the right environment for things to happen. And there, the critical question that we used to ask when promoting people to director or senior director levels is, did this happen because of them or despite them? That's a
mm.
very simple question that lets you understand what was their impact.
That's a very powerful question. That really is because I feel like I need to process that for a moment because it's it is such a good question, and it's something that I think a misconception I see in the conversations that I'm having. It's like there's almost this need for control for leaders,
Mhm,
especially when they've been promoted recently. It's like I have to prove myself. I have to really step into this role and make an impact. And the best way that they often know how, and maybe we can go into like societal conditioning of this, but it's often this like I have to do it through control and through force. And I have to like get in on everything and like micromanage in a sense to make sure that it's done, to make sure I'm making the impact that I want because now my reputation's on the line. And
mhm.
like that is such a great question. I'm just going to keep coming back to it. I loved it because it is. It's like when you are doing that, like when you are too hands on, you're harming your team, even though you may have good intentions. Like it's not
Yeah.
coming through.
I think these days complicated because with everything that's going on with the economy, the job market, layoffs, there's this need to prove that you're needed,
Yeah.
right? Otherwise, you may be laid off, and that's really hard. It's a really hard position to be put in because you feel the urge to prove yourself and prove that you put your hands on that thing and that's why it works now, so don't get rid of me, right? Which goes counter the principles of leadership, which should, you know I just coach the team and make sure that even when I'm not here, things go well. But then the logical step is like, well, if I can go, they can fire me, which is not the step you should be thinking about. But unfortunately, just reading the news, you just want to keep your job, right? And one way of sort of you can explain the psychological principles behind it is like try to put yourself into as many things as possible so they'll see that you're busy and they cannot let you go.
Yeah. Yeah, it's very true. I need to think about that a little bit deeper for a second, but like there's just so many things that go into it psychologically, especially maybe this is a good time to come back to that and the idea of like cultural differences and cultural norms and like biases and
Mhm.
all of that are at play, especially now. And I imagine even more so at a place like Google, where it's like so interconnected. More and more companies are going global and have different workers in different parts of the world. And there's so many different layers and nuances that come with that. And so maybe we can start with just unpacking your experience, like even your transition going to the US
Mhm.
and like the cultural differences that you were exposed to and the way that you had to adapt your own leadership style to that.
Yeah. Well, I think there's definitely talking about biases. Like there's a proximity bias, right? For sure. And it's funny because as like I always suffered, quote unquote, suffered being in Europe from the decision taken from Mountain View, because I was always say Google is not a multinational, it's an international company with, so it's an American company with sites abroad, which is very different because everything is taken, decisions are taken centrally. So when I was in Europe, I was like, well, when I'll go to the US, I'll make sure I'll keep in mind the region's struggle with the fact that decisions come from Mountain View. Well, guess what? 6 months in, you almost forgot
Yeah.
because you're in the middle of it. It's not because I didn't know. It's just because you're there. Decisions are made in quick meetings and so famous coffee meetings or water cooler conversations, and it was like that, right? And then Europe wakes up and you kind of deliver the decisions or you involve them last minute. So there is a proximity bias. There is something that needs to be taken into account when you lead a global team versus a team that's all in the same city, or in a hybrid environment. Someone has the opportunity to close the video conference and continue the conversation while you're on the other side of the world and you're disconnected, literally.
Yeah, it's a very good point. And so maybe circling back to the concept of relationships and communication, how do you find leaders have to adapt the way that they speak to consider or account for like cultural differences,
Mhm.
cultural norms, things like that?
Yeah, that's a great question, and I think at a certain extent you always need to adapt to your boss's style.
Mm,
That's sort of my experience.
yeah.
No matter how much the boss needs to flex their style to accommodate cultures. However, there's a very distinct way in which folks that work in Asia or in Europe or in the US, deal with things and discuss things. What is really important is just giving the opportunity for everyone to speak at a table, whether they're more reserved or they're video conference or they're dialing in from Japan, or they feel that they wouldn't interrupt anyone because of their culture. There's so many factors, but it really boils down to you as a leader just asking the question, what do you think? Now I
Mm,
want to hear XYZ's opinion because they haven't spoken yet.
yeah.
Sort of solicit that conversation. And maybe they don't have anything to say, which is fine, but you need to be the one almost passing the mic to
Mm,
everyone for everyone to have the chance to speak. And basic things, I always remember there were these long video conference tables, and there was always a chair at the head of the table in
yeah.
front of video camera, right? So I was on the other side of the video camera with this chair kind of covering half of the video conference. So that was uncomfortable. I had to say, hey guys, can you move the chair? That should be something that doesn't happen. And then people just like eating chips, and so all the noise in the mics, or banging their fists, or their fingers. So just make it a little bit easier for everyone to participate on an equal playing field with very basic things. Again, I'll repeat myself. It's just going back to some very basics, human connection things. Oh, someone is on a video conference. Maybe we should take out the chair in front of the camera. Someone is on a microphone. Maybe you shouldn't eat your chips on the mic. Very basic things, but we forget easily.
Yeah, it's true. And like that's exactly how you build that psychological safety. Like even
Yeah.
if you have to call it out, but especially to your point, like you go around the room and you get everyone to participate
Hmm.
and you at least invite them for the opportunity to participate. Because I've spoken with many leaders who sort of hesitate and like that used to be me. I used to sit at the very back,
Hmm.
at the back of every class, at the back of every meeting. I did not want to speak up and like I've always had this dichotomy personally where on the one hand I was always like very alpha and very outgoing and very like outspoken. And yet a large part of me was like, I don't want to be here. I don't want to be seen. And it was like such a weird process to go to for myself to even develop the skill of like even like I was mentioning earlier, like a couple years ago, I would have never been caught on social media. Like I would have never posted a video of myself or anything. And like now here I am. And like
The
that's a
queen of
skill.
videos.
Thank you. But it's like it's a lot of this is like skills that people have to learn, and it all starts
Mhm.
with that self-reflection and that like I need to push myself and I need to try and I need to go back to the basics and understand how I am doing on these basics before I can even layer in things like psychological safety.
Yeah.
And so,
And
yeah,
and many of these reactions or oversights, let's say, are because everyone is so busy, right?
yes.
So you jump in a meeting, you're rushing from another one, so you're not fully present in this one, and there's the phone notification, and and this and that. So I think again, let's remove some layers, let's remove some unnecessary meetings and busyness, and let's go back to some very sort of human norms that are discovered or rediscovered through also being present in the moment.
Yes. And so maybe we'll unpack how to even be present in the moment a little bit more. And then I want to go back to like the mindset and the biases because I think there's so much there that's good as well. Um,
Mhm.
I guess like just general recommendation because like everyone is busy, everyone's stressed, everyone has 72 tabs in their mind open of like things they need to do. What would you recommend as like maybe one or two things they can do practically to actually start being present?
Yeah. I mean, it's silly, but I got into a session with one of my clients, a CIO coming from our charge meetings. And, the first thing I told him, like, just take a deep breath, maybe two deep breaths, and just relax. We're in a different space, sort of acknowledging and calling out that this is a different space,
Yes.
different situation. Do it for yourself, right? The other, like, remove your phone.
Mm,
Don't have it in sight. Potentially put it somewhere, in your backpack and stuff. Because having it on the phone or on the table, you know what's going to happen, right? If it buzzes or rings, you're going to pick it up and see what's that, and it's going to be very disruptive for the person that you actually have in front of you. And then practically what I do or what I used to do at Google is try to organize all my one-to-ones in one after the other,
mm,
like with reasonable breaks,
yeah.
because I'm in the coaching space, right? So imagine instead coming from a forecast meeting that maybe wasn't that fun, and then you jump into one-to-one where someone is trying to get some problems unpacked, and then you jump into another decision meeting and back to people. That doesn't work. There's some emotional and sort of cognitive sort of switching costs.
Yes.
So if you pack your one-to-ones, maybe 3, 4, 5 in a row with some maybe 10 minutes break between one another, and you put them in one afternoon, in one morning, you're in that space, in a listening space. You can hear people out. You can be the best coach you can.
Yeah, I like that a lot. And I think going back to the basics as well, it's like move your body if you can. Make sure you're drinking water as well. Have some sort of protein bar, granola bar, apple, something because it makes a difference. Like it's crazy how much the basics are overlooked and like
Yeah.
you have to go back to them. And it always makes me laugh because it seems too simple to work. I feel like most
Mhm.
of us are now like, I need this hack, I need this thing, I need this secret
Yeah. Yeah.
formula. Like it's the basics that are
I
rinse
know.
and repeat.
I think biohacking and AI applied in the wrong spaces, or anything that can make you more productive, as in like quicker and faster, is not the right direction when it comes to giving attention and being present, right?
Hmm. I agree with that. I think I have a theory that in order to be present, well, number one, someone has to learn what mindfulness is and how to actually practice it for themselves. And when I first heard of the concept of mindfulness, even though I'm, deep diving into psychology, I was like, "Pff, what's this going to get me? Like, this is silly, but it's so effective. And so, my theory is that not enough people are self reflective, and not enough people are taking the time to actually do the things to understand what is going on internally, what's going on in their mind, how their body is feeling. And it's leading to all these additional lenses and layers and triggers that are preventing them from being present. And so a lot of the work that I do as well, it is that self-reflection component. It's like
Mhm.
understanding yourself. It's understanding what's triggering you and like why certain meetings are so hard to pay attention to, and like why are you fidgeting in some meetings and not others, and like these are all clues and cues, and they're so
Mhm.
often overlooked. But like you almost have to. It's like if it's an attic, like if your mind is an attic that is stuffed with things, it's going to be hard to pay attention and to be present anywhere in life until you can kind of clear all the junk out the way and make a clear path for yourself. So that's almost how I
Yeah.
see it.
Brilliant.
Thank you. Okay. Now, if anyone is not convinced that they should be working on their leadership skills and their executive presence, could you speak to some of the things that you have seen or some of your experiences with what happens when they don't work on these things?
Well, the best case scenario is they stay where they are and they continue to suffer from a self inflicted pain in a way that they'll keep blaming external circumstances for things that don't work and turning a blind eye to what they could be working on. There's more that we can control in leadership than we think. And I think the current environment has taught us that there's a lot outside of our control. And it's easy to blame the system. It's easy to blame the role. It's easy to blame, the relationships. But the reality is you're just drinking your own poison.
Mm.
And another very back to basics is if he hasn't worked so far, why do you think that keeping doing the same is going to yield different results?
Yeah, that's a very good point. And so just to unpack one more major concept.
Mhm.
What is your take on how important emotional intelligence is in leadership?
Yeah, well, emotional intelligence is a layer that is becoming more and more important.
Mm,
From a technical point of view, bear with me, is
yep,
organizations are more and more matrix organizations. People are asked to, especially at the higher level, to sort of exert authority or control things they don't have formal authority over, right? So you may have a small team of 5, but your job is to influence thousands,
yeah.
right? And you don't do it with process, you don't do it with command, you don't do it with authority. You do it with emotional intelligence, with your influencing, which is, has a 80% component of emotional intelligence. You do it with listening, and you do it with your executive presence.
So then what are some practical strategies that someone can do to start developing the skill of emotional intelligence?
It comes down to listening first.
Mm,
And again, one of the basics, it seems silly, but it is. Start with a one to one. I've been working with a client who starts their one to one with, the laundry list of things that need to be done and process oriented, right? Instead, start with one to one with like, how are you feeling? How was your week? And kind of unpack a little bit their emotional state and how do you feel in the job, and is there anything that worries you about your current role, or this happened or that project, and you know how's family, how's like it comes down to getting a little bit personal. And people think that personal is not appropriate in the workplace. It should be professional, while they're not mutually exclusive. Actually, being professional is also having interest in our team members' personal life and emotions and feelings. So start with that. And you may feel uncomfortable a little bit at the beginning asking about their feelings, and then keep going. Like the second question should be, oh, okay, tell me more, you know? And so just keep going until you feel it's a nice, friendly conversation, and that you learn a little bit about their emotional state, and then reflect on that a little bit. Oh, they told me they're worried about the targets. Why are they worried? And let me ask you next time. And I think again, we put so many layers, unnecessary layers that cover the emotional intelligence that then it's really hard to strip them back and go to a very human and normal conversation.
Yeah. And I think this is a really good time to interject those biases that we kept talking about
Hmm.
because we see things from the lens of our experiences. And it takes intention to recognize that how we see things, the default reactions that we have, the default everything that we have is literally us. And because it's our lived experience, it's the way that we do everything. Number one, we tend to assume that everyone sees it and thinks about it the same way. And number two, we think that they have a similar perspective, right? And so
Hmm.
part of emotional intelligence is unpacking your own lens, your own experiences, your own biases, your own ways of thinking, and recognizing that just because I do it, just because I think it's good, doesn't mean that you think that. And like that, I think is a very good first step as well to like unpack things. And so for anyone listening who has a hard time with that sort of personal bit, I'll add in a little bit, and that's recognizing and like being emotionally intelligent and recognizing subtle changes in someone's tone, in someone's emotional expressions,
Hmm.
so like their facial expressions and their body
Yeah.
language that either indicate they're uncomfortable or they're holding something back, or sometimes they really want to talk about something and something's really bothering them, but they don't feel comfortable bringing it up. And so I think part of that is really starting to unpack these pieces, and they're like moving pieces in a conversation. And so, from your experience, like how important is something like body language, which is so
Yeah.
broad, but like I'll let
No,
you
it's
go
it's
first. 'Cause-
it's
yeah.
really important, and I think one thing that I do when I see someone maybe a little bit different, I cannot quite pinpoint. It's like, hey, I feel today your energy levels are a little bit lower than usual. Is everything okay? And that can just open up a conversation like, no, well, this is happening, or I'm okay, or I just didn't sleep because my kids kept me up at night, and because life happens. It's not, and that helps connecting and creating that sort of safe space, and that is your piece of emotional intelligence right there. They say that nonverbal communications is up to 80%, so you'll know better, and definitely spotting those cues and making sure also over video conference that you are very in tune with the person on the other side of the screen. And we all learned more over COVID. But yeah, if you see someone on the screen and you notice something different, just call it out, not in a negative way. Say, hey, I'm noticing. Hey,
Yeah.
I see, or I perceive. Am I wrong? But I feel that today, there's something up. Just don't feel you're invading the privacy, because actually it's a genuine interest.
Yeah, and I like your point there. Like it's not invading, but it's sometimes it's just again coming from a place of neutrality and genuine curiosity rather than judgment, which can like sneak into our tone and our facial expressions and our body language. But it's that emotional intelligence component where it's like, I think that I'm noticing something about you, something's different, but I'm
Hmm.
scared to ask you because I think it's overstepping boundaries. Versus if you can make that shift and just again, from a place of curiosity, it's like, "Hey, are you okay?" Just checking in real quick.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, the rule is like, would you do that with one of your friends? If the
Mm,
answer is yes, you should do it at work, even if it's your boss. It happened to me so many times. Like, hey, man, like, I see you're a little bit nervous. Is everything okay? Was there some like tense meetings? Do you want to reschedule? Do you want to take a break? Like, that's human, right? So, as we should be.
yeah, and I think it's right there in the name, emotionally intelligent,
Yeah.
like knowing
Yeah.
what to do with the emotions instead of like wishing they weren't there because it would make your life easier.
Exactly.
Yeah. I'll leave it there. Awesome. All right. So for the listeners, as we wrap up, what are two or three things that they can do, practically speaking, to sort of start putting the pieces together and just like up their leadership game?
It's a great question. I think start asking for feedback,
Mm.
unsolicited feedback to your manager, to your peers, and start listening to that feedback in a way that you haven't done before. and not try to excuse that feedback. Or even if some feedback can hurt, there's always a nugget of truth in there. So I would just start asking, like, hey, what do you think I could do better? Either like open like this, or specifically in my delivery, or in my presentation, in the way I run team meetings, etc. And if you run a team session where we used to call happiness huddle, where the team members would tell us managers everything they loved about the team and some of the things they would like to change. And the exercise was really just listening, acknowledging, and say, okay, interesting, tell me more. How could we solve this, for example? Again, this is really basic, but no one does it. And it's not weakness, it's not silly, it's not being a strong leader. It's really developing a relationship with your team members and developing yourself as a leader. And my question to you all is, what's the worst that can happen? And the answer is like absolutely nothing. But you have a big upside.
Yeah, I agree with that. I think too many times feedback is saved for special occasions, and that's what makes it
Mhm.
so negative and so scary. And I'm a big fan. I always tell my clients, like, make feedback a normal part of the process for everyone, and then it stops being scary. And then by doing it over and over again, number one, everyone's anticipating it. Number two, everyone starts to give it better because they get more practice giving the feedback. And then it just stops being scary and it's just part of the process of growing. And that's how people
Mhm.
go from like, oh my God, my evaluation is coming up. What are they going to say? To like, I've had all these reps of feedback. Like I know I've improved, which
Yeah.
is which is awesome. And I think the flip side of that, for anyone who still has some fear and doubt around feedback, it's like, well, how frustrating is it to be in a position where you're doing the same frustrating thing and maybe you're even telling your manager and they're just not listening. Like I remember I worked at a company once where there was a massive flaw in the system. We were working with like a partner, a major organization, and we had to keep faxing them information. And they were literally just like discarding our faxes. Like they weren't even looking at them. And it was like,
For who's listening, a fax is an ancient machine used to transmit information.
yeah, 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 but, like, they wanted us to fax them. Like, corporate head office wanted us to fax each individual, location, and, like, each location was not reading our faxes, and these faxes had crucial, like, time-sensitive information, and so I remember bringing it up over and over and over, and it was like, "Why aren't we doing something about it?" And like, "Well, we don't know how. We're working on it. Head office isn't cooperating." Like, meh, 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 like,
Yeah.
that doesn't leave me feeling any better doing my job. Like, that's worse than actually taking the feedback. So I'll leave that there. Okay, one more final question.
Yeah.
What is one of the biggest mindset shifts that you think someone can make to even start taking on the concept of being a better leader?
It's not about you.
Nice.
And the more you realize it, the quicker you realize it, the better it is. It's never been about you, and it's not going to be about you. So the moment you make it about others, everything shifts and you start joining the right dots, not the dots that are about you and your promotion and your salary and your project. Is more about the success of others, which in turn will will lead to promotions and all the good rewards.
Yeah, I like that. I like that a lot. It's a very good mindset shift to make because it also takes so much pressure off of like, I need to be
Yep.
perfect. So awesome. Okay. Any final words that you'd like to leave the listeners with?
No, I think thank you for these opportunities because we don't talk enough about all these topics. So I think the more forums like this that we have to discuss with topics, the more we normalize them, right?
Mm.
We may repeat a lot of things multiple times because they are important.
Yeah.
And I think every time we see a slightly different angle, so I just encourage everyone to just keep pursuing the betterment of themselves as far as leadership goes, and definitely work with you and others, because nowadays you don't need to do it alone, right? 20
Yeah.
years ago, maybe. Today there's so many precious resources like this one, and So it's important to not feel alone in the journey.
Yeah. And I think I'm going to reiterate the question of take a moment to consider, are you helping your team or are they thriving despite of you? I think that's a
Hmm.
beautiful question to leave everyone with. So, for everyone interested in you and your work and your experience, where can they find you? Where should they go?
Yeah, you can look me up on LinkedIn. Simone Schiassi is going to be in the footnotes of the podcast, and you can DM me or just follow along the journey. And